Good day to you. My name is Robert Hardy. I am the Operations Director of the Customs Clearance Consortium. As the title of the presentation suggests, I'd like to talk to you about Incoterms and their impact on customs processes. There are various Incoterms, but the most common we come across are ex-works and DDP, delivered duty paid. In this particular presentation, we want to concentrate on DDP, as this has more pitfalls, shall we say, than the other Incoterms that can be applied. Okay, this is a fairly common scenario. We have a European supplier and a UK buyer. What we find in a lot of cases is that the European supplier, for example, will sell on DDP terms because it's nice and simple in a Brexit environment, or in some cases the UK buyer will only buy on DDP terms because they've got rather more power than their supplier and therefore are not willing to pay the duty that is potentially chargeable on their goods. So we have a European supplier, a UK buyer, we have a supplier who's relatively happy and a buyer who's very happy. However, in a DDP environment, the importer is not who you think it is. In many cases you may think it's the UK buyer that is the importer, and that would not be the case. It's actually the EU exporter who requires a virtual identity in the UK in order to be the importer in order to supply on a DDP basis. DDP is essentially a domestic supply. So what does the EU exporter require in the UK? Well, they need a VAT number, they'll need an EORI number. They don't actually need to have a UK company. It can all be done remotely. You will need a UK VAT agent. In some European territories that is a fiscal representative, but in the UK it can be done without a fiscal representative. And most importantly, you will require a customs import agent who is prepared to work on your behalf on an indirect basis. That's not easy. Once you have the registrations you require in the UK, then you will essentially be supplying from the EU to your virtual identity in the UK, and the virtual identity in the UK will be taking care of customs formalities. Duty will be paid by you, VAT will be paid by you, and the goods will be eventually, once cleared, will be in free circulation in the UK. Only once that has been completed can your virtual identity now supply your UK buyer, which, remember, to all intents and purposes is a domestic supply. The invoice you would raise would be the same as you would raise today, and that can be with your EU address. There's no problem with that at all. However, the VAT number shown on the invoice for the seller will be your UK VAT number, and you will charge your UK buyer UK VAT if applicable. So the transaction is, as I say, domestic. So what don't we like about DDP? Well, in a DDP environment, the seller is responsible for raising the export declaration in their country. That's fine, they're expecting that. But what they weren't expecting is the seller is also responsible for the import entry, the duty and the VAT, that's the biggest point, in the buyer's country. Caution here, the seller may need to register for VAT and EORI in the buyer's country, as we've shown on previous slides. We much prefer DAP as opposed to DDP, and we'll look at that in a moment. So in a DDP environment, all of the charges go back to the seller. That's not so much a problem in its own right, but the biggest problem is that may include import VAT, in which case the European seller will require a UK VAT identity. There is a softer option of DDP, but this requires a conversation between the seller and the UK buyer. In this softer option, there is no requirement for the seller to have any UK registration in terms of VAT or EORI, and certainly does not require a UK company. In the situation we've shown below, the seller is responsible for raising the export declaration as before, and as he is perfectly comfortable with. The seller is responsible for the import entry and the import duty. However, the agent pays the duty on their deferment account and charges the documentation charge and the duty back to the seller. In this scenario, the UK buyer, is shown on the customs entry as the UK importer, and that's got to be noticed that is actually the importer of record, and there are some liabilities with that. But in this case, the VAT goes forward and the documentation charge and duty goes backward. It's To my mind, it's a good solution because the UK buyer will end up with VAT in any case, either from the new virtual identity of the EU supplier or in this instance directly to customs at importation. Now, although we weren't specifically going to mention anything other than DDP, we can't resist mentioning XWorks. This has a similar impact in that XWorks is essentially a domestic supply. In an XWorks environment, the buyer is responsible for raising the buyer. Note that the buyer is responsible for raising the export declaration in the seller's country. You have to ask yourself, do you have the capabilities to raise an export declaration and potentially an export health certificate in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, or any other countries that you buy from? In most cases, I doubt it. The buyer is also responsible for the import entry, duty and VAT in their country, but that's fine. They were kind of expecting that in any case. However, in an XWorks environment again, the seller isn't responsible for any of the documentation. However, the export is zero rated for VAT, and the seller has a vested interest in having the export declaration done correctly in order to discharge their VAT liability. We much prefer FCA over XWorks, which is kind of one step in from the furthest point on Incoterms, which is XWorks. In nearly all cases, we've found that the most suitable is, instead of XWorks, you have FCA, which is basically XWorks, but the exporter is doing the export declaration and the health certificate and so on and so forth. So the exporter is taking care of the goods up to the point of them being ready to export. And instead of DDP, wherever possible, DAP, which is delivered at place but excluding duties and taxes. In this scenario, it's lovely and clean. The exporter is responsible for the export and the importer is responsible for the import. I take it that that's a fairly utopian view, but if possible, that would always be our preferred choice because there's no need for any additional registrations in foreign territories, shall we say. Equally, that could be a commercial decision between the buyer and the seller. You've got to remember that Incoterms are international commercial terms, not international customs terms. And it is, not beyond the realms of possibility that the buyer and seller have a conversation and maybe say, well, look, the buyer is not willing to accept the duty and the documentation charges, but they will, and they'll deduct it from the eventual payment to the seller, which is a kind of a simulated DDP, if you like, without all of the fluff. Now, although we've got 10 months of a transition period to go, we brought this to your attention now because it needs acting on now. If you are selling on a DDP basis, then you will almost certainly require a VAT registration, the ORI registration, and so on and so forth. And that takes time. It's not something we can fix at the last minute. What you might be pleased to know is the Customs Clearance Consortium is a UK VAT agent and can represent you for VAT purposes in the UK. We can arrange UK VAT registration, UK EORI number registration, which comes along once we have the UK VAT number, and we can also look after your UK VAT returns up to the point of transition and beyond. It's also important to note that the transition period is very, very unlikely to be extended beyond December 2020, and that almost no matter which final decision is made, the processes I've just explained, because there will be customs paperwork involved, will be just as relevant whether it's a Canada-style deal, an Australia-style deal, or no blooming deal at all. So, we hope this short video on Incoterms, which is a subject that really doesn't get enough coverage because it really doesn't have an owner in the process. It's important that before you work out what solution you're going to put in place for your customs processes, that you first of all have to identify what those customs processes are, and before you can do that, you have to identify and agree with your suppliers and buyers what Incoterms you'll be working against, because they do seriously have an impact on the solution that we can provide. We're going to try to do a series of these short presentation videos in order to cover what we consider to be the most important issues. Incoterms for us is absolutely number one. The other videos that we'll do in the next few weeks will be a sort of walkthrough of the processes, when documentation can be raised, how early can documentation be raised, and so on and so forth, and what information is required now, and then what information is required on a transactional level. Please go to our website www.eori.uk. It's updated regularly. The last update was about a week ago. It's got a lot of content in there which is all Brexit related and nothing else really. And this video will also be uploaded to that site so that you've got constant reference to it in the Incoterms section, believe it or not. Thank you for listening, and watch out for the next video.